Rachel Caldwell never imagined that the biggest threat to her unborn child would come from the woman now living with her ex-husband. 6 months pregnant and trying to rebuild her life after the divorce, Rachel believed the worst chapter of her story had already passed. The arguments, the heartbreak, the quiet emptiness that followed the separation, she thought she had endured it all. Then one night, a message appeared on her phone that made her hands tremble. "Keep quiet about the baby, or things will get worse." At first she assumed it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a wrong number. Maybe a prank. But the uneasiness in her chest refused to fade. And soon, strange things began happening. A dark car parked across the street late at night. Footsteps she thought she heard outside her porch. The quiet feeling that someone might be watching her house when the lights were off. The more Rachel tried to understand what was going on, the more one name kept resurfacing in her thoughts. Vanessa Cole. The new woman in Ethan's life. The woman who believed Rachel's pregnancy was nothing more than a trap. But what Vanessa didn't realize was that the truth about that pregnancy would eventually destroy everything she believed she was protecting. One calm morning in suburban Colorado, Rachel stood in her kitchen staring down at her phone. Sunlight streamed gently through the windows, casting soft light across the quiet room. Outside, the neighborhood looked perfectly peaceful. Children waited for school buses. Neighbors watered their lawns. Everything appeared normal. But Rachel felt a slow, creeping unease spreading through her chest. Living alone while pregnant had forced her to become comfortable with silence. The house still carried traces of the life she once shared with Ethan Caldwell, but those memories now felt distant and hollow. Sometimes she would pause in the hallway, half expecting to hear his voice in another room. That instinct still lingered, even though their marriage had ended 8 months ago. Ethan Caldwell had always been respected in their community. As a financial consultant, he built his career helping families plan their futures. People trusted him with their savings and investments. Friends described him as calm, rational, and disciplined. Someone who rarely allowed emotions to cloud his judgment. Even after the divorce, that reputation remained unchanged. To outsiders, Ethan and Rachel's separation looked surprisingly peaceful. There were no public arguments, no dramatic confrontations. Friends often said they had handled the situation maturely. But Rachel knew the truth was more complicated. Peace was not the word she would have chosen. Their marriage had lasted 7 years. At the beginning, those years were filled with excitement and ambition. They talked about their future constantly, careers, travel plans, and the family they hoped to build together. For a long time, Rachel believed their life was solid. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. Ethan started working longer hours. Conversations became shorter. The warmth that once existed between them slowly faded. When Rachel finally asked what was wrong, Ethan gave an answer she never forgot. He said the relationship had lost its spark. The words sounded cold and strangely clinical, as if he were discussing a failing investment instead of a marriage. After that, everything happened quickly. The divorce papers were signed. The house was divided. Friends were told it had been a mutual decision. But there was one detail almost no one knew. A few weeks after the separation, Ethan came back. It happened one evening when they met to discuss some remaining paperwork. The conversation started practical but slowly drifted into memories of the past. Old jokes resurfaced. Shared stories. For a brief moment, both of them allowed themselves to pretend that the marriage had never ended. That night was quiet and emotional. And the next morning, Ethan left with a soft apology, insisting it had been a mistake. 3 weeks later, Rachel discovered she was pregnant. When she told Ethan the news, he looked stunned, but composed. He promised he would support the child financially. He said he would take responsibility. But he also made one thing very clear. Their relationship was over. Rachel accepted that reality. What mattered most to her now was the life growing inside her. Still, the months after the divorce unfolded faster than she expected. Ethan did not remain single for long. Only 2 months after the separation, a woman named Vanessa Cole entered his life. Vanessa was everything Rachel was not. Sharp, confident, intensely ambitious. At 31, she had already built a strong reputation in the marketing industry as someone who could win difficult clients and close high-stakes deals. People admired her determination. But there was also something calculating about her personality. Something that made conversations with her feel more like negotiations than friendly exchanges. Within weeks, Vanessa moved into Ethan's luxury downtown condo. To Rachel, the speed of that change felt surreal. It was as if Ethan had started an entirely new chapter of his life before the previous one had even finished. What Rachel didn't realize was how Vanessa truly viewed the pregnancy. In Vanessa's mind, the unborn child represented something dangerous, a permanent connection between Ethan and his past. She believed Rachel was using the baby to pull Ethan back into her life. And Vanessa Cole had never been someone who tolerated obstacles. Ethan understood that better than anyone. Over the past few weeks, he had watched Vanessa grow increasingly tense whenever Rachel's name came up in conversation. Her questions became sharper. Her patience thinner. What began as curiosity slowly turned into suspicion. And that was exactly why Rachel had received the message that morning. Rachel read Ethan's latest text again. "We need to talk today. It's important." The words were simple, almost formal. But something about them made her uneasy. Ethan rarely sounded urgent. Normally he approached problems calmly. This time felt different. Almost nervous. An hour later, Rachel arrived at a small cafe on the edge of downtown. Soft music played in the background, and only a few customers sat near the windows. Ethan was already there. The moment Rachel saw him, a strange chill moved through her body. Ethan Caldwell did not look calm. His shoulders were tense. His eyes kept shifting toward the entrance as if he expected someone else to walk in. When Rachel sat across from him, he attempted a smile, but it didn't quite form. "Rachel," he said quietly. She studied his face. "You sounded worried," she said. "What's going on?" For a moment Ethan didn't answer. He glanced briefly at her stomach, then down at the table. His fingers tightened around the coffee cup in front of him. Finally he spoke. "There's something you need to understand." Rachel leaned forward, confused. Ethan hesitated, as if the next sentence required more courage than he expected. "You need to stop talking about the pregnancy," he whispered. Rachel blinked. "What?" Ethan swallowed slowly and glanced around the cafe again. Then he looked back at her. "Rachel." His voice dropped even lower. "Someone doesn't want this baby to exist." And in that moment, Rachel realized the conversation she expected, about support, responsibility, or reassurance, had suddenly turned into something far more disturbing. Vanessa Cole had never been the type of woman who quietly accepted obstacles in her life. From a young age, she had learned that if something stood in her way, the only real solution was to remove it. Long before she ever stepped into Ethan Caldwell's polished world of corporate meetings and expensive restaurants, Vanessa's life looked very different. She grew up in a cramped apartment above a loud street in Dayton, Ohio. The place always smelled faintly of fried food from the restaurant below, and the thin walls meant she could hear almost everything happening around her. Money had always been uncertain in her childhood. Sometimes it was there for a few weeks, and sometimes it disappeared just as quickly. Her mother worked 2 jobs, constantly exhausted but determined to keep things afloat. Her father drifted in and out of their lives, moving between temporary jobs and long stretches of absence. From that environment, Vanessa learned something early: stability didn't come from kindness or patience. It came from control. By the time she reached her late 20s, Vanessa had transformed herself completely. The girl from the small apartment in Dayton had turned into a confident, ambitious professional. Working in marketing taught her how to read people quickly, how to spot their weaknesses, understand their motivations, and quietly steer situations in her favor. She admired success. But more importantly, she admired people who already had it. Ethan Caldwell fit that image perfectly. They first met at a corporate networking event in Denver. Vanessa noticed him almost immediately. Ethan carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind that didn't need to demand attention to be noticed. His reputation as a respected financial consultant suggested stability, influence, and long-term security. Everything Vanessa had been working towards suddenly felt within reach. Their relationship moved quickly after that. Ethan appreciated Vanessa's intelligence and ambition. She challenged him in conversations and understood the strategic thinking behind his work. Vanessa, in return, admired the structured life Ethan had built for himself. But from the very beginning, she noticed something else about him. There were still traces of his past marriage everywhere. Rachel Caldwell was rarely mentioned directly, yet her presence lingered in small details. A photograph that hadn't been removed from Ethan's study. A casual reference to an old routine they once shared. Small reminders that his life before Vanessa hadn't fully disappeared. At first Vanessa ignored those things. She assumed time would erase them. Then Rachel's pregnancy changed everything. The moment Vanessa learned Rachel was expecting Ethan's child, a quiet tension began to grow inside her. At first she tried to dismiss the feeling, telling herself it was temporary. But curiosity slowly sharpened into suspicion. Late at night, when Ethan fell asleep beside her, Vanessa would scroll through Rachel's social media profiles. Rachel's posts weren't dramatic or confrontational. Most of them were simple, photos from a walk in the park, a cup of coffee on a porch railing, updates about preparing for the baby. But to Vanessa, every image felt deliberate. She studied each post carefully. She read the comments left by friends congratulating Rachel on the pregnancy. She noticed how often Ethan's name appeared indirectly in conversations about the child's future. Gradually, a troubling idea began forming in Vanessa's mind. Rachel wasn't just moving forward with her life. She was creating a permanent connection. A thread that would tie Ethan to her forever. And once that idea took hold, Vanessa couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening Ethan sat at the dining table reviewing financial reports on his laptop while Vanessa watched him quietly from across the room. The apartment was calm, but the silence between them carried an unspoken tension. "You've been texting Rachel again," Vanessa said casually. Ethan glanced up from the screen. "She's pregnant, Vanessa. There are things we have to discuss." Vanessa leaned back slightly in her chair. "Or maybe she knows exactly what she's doing." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Her voice stayed calm, but there was a precise edge beneath it. "Think about the timing," she said. "You two divorce, and suddenly she's pregnant. You really believe that's just coincidence?" Ethan rubbed his forehead slowly. "Rachel isn't like that." "You're sure?" Vanessa asked quietly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like she just guaranteed you'll never fully leave her life." The words hung in the air. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His sense of responsibility toward the unborn child weighed heavily on him, but Vanessa's questions planted doubts he hadn't considered before. Vanessa noticed that hesitation. She understood exactly how uncertainty worked. "You deserve peace, Ethan," she said softly. "You deserve a life that actually moves forward." Over the following weeks the tension grew steadily. Ethan tried to balance both situations, discussing practical matters with Rachel while reassuring Vanessa that his future belonged with her. But the more he tried to manage everything calmly, the more convinced Vanessa became that Rachel represented a threat. And Vanessa had never been someone who tolerated threats quietly. One afternoon Rachel left a grocery store carrying a small bag filled with prenatal vitamins and fresh fruit. As she stepped into the parking lot, she noticed a woman standing near a silver sedan. It took Rachel a moment to recognize her. Vanessa Cole. Vanessa approached slowly, her posture composed and confident. "So you're Rachel," she said. Rachel tightened her grip on the bag. "Yes." Vanessa studied her for several seconds, her eyes moving briefly toward Rachel's stomach. "You think a baby will bring him back?" Vanessa asked. Rachel blinked, surprised by the blunt question. "I don't want him back," Rachel replied calmly. "I just want my child to have a father." Vanessa narrowed her eyes slightly, as if measuring whether the answer was genuine. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Vanessa gave a small, controlled smile. "You should be careful about the expectations you build," she said quietly. Without another word she turned and walked back toward her car. Rachel remained standing in the parking lot for a moment, unsettled by the strange coldness of the encounter. There had been no shouting. No open anger. But something about Vanessa's tone felt deeply unsettling. It didn't sound like jealousy. It sounded like calculation. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the houses in Rachel's neighborhood, she stepped onto her porch to take out the trash. The street felt unusually quiet. And then she noticed something. A dark car parked across the road. Rachel stared at it for several seconds. The vehicle had been there the previous night as well. At first she thought it might belong to a neighbor. But slowly, a realization crept into her mind. She had seen that exact same car somewhere before. Not in this neighborhood, but outside Ethan's condo building. Rachel Caldwell stood on her porch for several seconds, staring across the quiet street at the dark car. The neighborhood was peaceful, the kind of place where most people knew their neighbors and rarely locked their doors during the day. Normally, a parked vehicle wouldn't have seemed unusual. But something about this one made her uneasy. Mostly because she had seen it before. Not here. Outside Ethan's condo building downtown. At first Rachel told herself she was overthinking things. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor. Maybe the similarity was just coincidence. Still, the longer she looked at it, the more unsettled she felt. The car's windows were tinted dark enough that she couldn't see inside. The engine wasn't running. No one stepped out. It simply sat there, watching. Rachel finally turned away and went back inside, trying to shake the feeling crawling up her spine. Pregnancy had already made her more sensitive to stress. She didn't want to convince herself of danger where none existed. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound in the house seemed louder than usual. The creak of the floorboards. The hum of the refrigerator. Even the wind brushing lightly against the windows. Several times she found herself getting out of bed to glance through the curtains. The car was still there. It didn't leave until nearly 2 in the morning. And when it finally did, Rachel was left lying awake with the quiet certainty that something about the situation was deeply wrong. The next morning she tried to focus on normal routines. Breakfast. Emails. A short walk around the block to clear her thoughts. But the sense of being watched didn't completely disappear. Later that afternoon her phone buzzed. For a brief second Rachel felt her stomach tighten, expecting another anonymous message. But when she checked the screen, the caller ID showed Ethan's name. She answered quickly. "Hi," she said. Ethan's voice sounded tired. "Rachel, we need to talk again." "That sounds serious," she replied carefully. "It is." There was a pause on the line. "I don't think you should stay alone at the house for a while," Ethan added. Rachel frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I'm serious," he said. "Just be careful, okay?" Before she could ask anything else, he ended the call. Rachel stared at the phone, confusion slowly mixing with concern. Ethan had always been calm, almost methodical when discussing problems. But lately his tone had changed. He sounded nervous. And Ethan Caldwell was not the type of man who frightened easily. Across the city, Ethan stood in the quiet living room of his downtown condo, staring out at the skyline. Behind him, Vanessa moved through the apartment with restless energy. She had been pacing for the last 20 minutes, occasionally checking her phone. "You're still worried about her," Vanessa said suddenly. Ethan turned toward her. "She's pregnant, Vanessa." "Of course I'm worried." Vanessa folded her arms. "You're worried about Rachel," she corrected. "Not the baby." "That's not fair," Ethan replied. "Isn't it?" Vanessa asked. Her voice remained calm, but the tension underneath was impossible to miss. "You're still tied to her, Ethan. Whether you admit it or not." Ethan exhaled slowly. "I'm responsible for the child. That's all." Vanessa studied him carefully. "You're sure about that?" The question lingered longer than Ethan expected. Vanessa walked toward the kitchen counter and picked up her phone. "You know," she said casually, "I've been doing some thinking." Ethan didn't respond. Vanessa continued. "If Rachel really cared about moving on, she wouldn't be posting those updates everywhere." "What updates?" "The pregnancy," Vanessa said. "The photos. The comments. All those people congratulating her." Ethan rubbed his temples. "She's allowed to share her life." Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "Or she's making sure everyone knows the baby is yours." The words hung heavily in the room. Ethan didn't answer. Later that evening, Rachel stepped outside again to check her mailbox. The air felt cooler now, the sky darkening as the sun dipped below the horizon. And once again, the same car sat parked across the street. This time Rachel was certain. It was the same vehicle. Her heart began beating faster. She stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. Finally she walked slowly toward the edge of her driveway, hoping to catch a glimpse of the driver. But before she could get close enough to see inside, the car's engine started. The headlights flickered on. And within seconds the vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the street. Rachel stood there in silence. The message. The warning. The strange car. All of it suddenly felt connected. And for the first time, Rachel began to wonder if someone wasn't just watching her. Someone might actually be planning something. Inside the departing car, a man glanced briefly at the rearview mirror. He picked up his phone and sent a short message. "Still pregnant. Still alone." Seconds later, a reply appeared on the screen. 2 simple words. "Keep watching." The next few days passed in a strange mixture of routine and quiet anxiety for Rachel Caldwell. On the surface, everything looked normal. She kept her regular doctor appointments. She bought groceries, answered calls from family members, and tried to prepare the house for the baby's arrival. From the outside, her life appeared calm and predictable. But underneath that routine, the uneasy feeling never completely left her. Every time she stepped outside, her eyes instinctively scanned the street. Every unfamiliar car made her pause. And every vibration from her phone made her heart beat a little faster. The threatening message still lingered in her mind. "Keep quiet about the baby, or things will get worse." Rachel hadn't told many people about it. At first she thought it might disappear if she ignored it. But now, after seeing the same car outside her house more than once, she wasn't so sure. One afternoon she called Ethan again. He answered on the third ring. "Rachel?" "Ethan, something strange has been happening," she said. His tone sharpened immediately. "What do you mean?" "I think someone has been watching my house." There was a pause on the line. "Watching you?" he repeated. "Yes. There's a car that keeps appearing outside. I've seen it at least 3 times this week." Ethan exhaled slowly. Did you see who was inside? No, Rachel said. The windows are tinted. Another pause followed. Rachel, Ethan said carefully, you're under a lot of stress right now. Pregnancy can make things feel more intense than they really are. Rachel felt a small wave of frustration. So you think I'm imagining it? I'm saying it might not mean anything, Ethan replied. Rachel didn't answer right away. She had hoped he would take the situation more seriously. I also got another message, she added quietly. That changed his tone. What message? The same number as before. What did it say? Rachel hesitated before repeating the words. Stop talking about the baby. Silence filled the line for several seconds. When Ethan finally spoke again, his voice sounded more tense than before. Rachel, if anything else like that happens, you need to tell me immediately. I just did, she replied. Across the city, Ethan lowered the phone slowly after the call ended. Vanessa stood near the kitchen counter watching him. You look stressed, she said. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Rachel thinks someone is watching her house. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. And? She says there's a car that keeps showing up. Vanessa shrugged lightly. Maybe it's just a neighbor. Ethan didn't look convinced. Vanessa walked closer to him. You can't keep letting her pull you into drama, she said. Rachel has always been emotional. That's not fair, Ethan replied. Vanessa crossed her arms. Isn't it? Ethan didn't respond. The conversation drifted into silence. Later that night, while Ethan slept, Vanessa sat alone in the dim glow of her laptop screen. Several tabs were open. Rachel's social media page. A map showing Rachel's neighborhood. And another window displaying recent messages. Vanessa typed a short reply. Keep watching. Across town, Rachel was lying awake in bed. Sleep had become difficult lately. Pregnancy had already made rest uncomfortable, but the lingering sense of being watched made it worse. Around midnight she heard a faint sound outside. At first she thought it was just the wind. Then she heard it again. The low rumble of an engine. Rachel slowly got out of bed and walked to the window. Her heart tightened when she pulled the curtain aside. The same dark car was parked across the street again. This time the headlights were off. The vehicle sat completely still. Rachel stared at it for nearly a minute. Then suddenly, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out. He stood beside the car for a moment, looking toward Rachel's house. Even from a distance, Rachel could feel his attention. Her heart started pounding. The man didn't approach the house. He simply looked. Then he got back into the car. A few seconds later the engine started. The vehicle drove away into the darkness. Rachel stepped back from the window, her hands shaking slightly. This was no longer a coincidence. Someone really was watching her. The next morning she made a decision. If the car returned again, she would call the police. Meanwhile, across the city, Vanessa Cole sat quietly in a cafe, scrolling through new photos Rachel had posted online. One picture showed Rachel standing in the baby's future room, smiling while holding a tiny set of clothes. Vanessa stared at the image for a long time. Her expression slowly hardened. To everyone else, the photo looked harmless. But to Vanessa, it felt like something else. A message. A reminder that Rachel and the baby would always be part of Ethan's life. Vanessa closed the phone and whispered softly to herself. That baby changes everything. Then she stood up, already thinking about what the next step needed to be. For several weeks Rachel Caldwell had been living with a quiet sense of unease. Nothing dramatic had happened yet, but the small signs around her life continued to build into something she couldn't ignore. The strange car. The anonymous messages. the uncomfortable feeling that someone might be watching her. Still, daily life demanded attention. Doctor appointments had to be kept. Groceries needed to be bought. Phone calls from family members had to be answered with reassuring words so they wouldn't worry. Rachel tried her best to maintain a sense of normal routine as the week slowly moved closer to her due date. On a cool Thursday morning, she drove to her scheduled prenatal appointment at the medical center downtown. She hoped that at least for a short time she could focus on something positive. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee. Several other expectant mothers sat quietly around the room, some flipping through magazines while others scrolled through their phones. The atmosphere was calm, filled with the quiet anticipation shared by people waiting for new life to arrive. Rachel rested one hand gently on her stomach. The baby shifted slightly, a small movement that always brought her a sense of comfort. Whatever tension surrounded her life lately, the child growing inside her had become the one thing that felt steady and real. When the nurse called her name, Rachel stood and followed her down the hallway to the examination room. The appointment began normally. Blood pressure readings. Routine questions. A few notes typed into the computer. But after a few minutes, Rachel noticed that her doctor was studying something on the screen with unusual focus. Dr. Melissa Grant had been overseeing Rachel's pregnancy from the beginning and usually maintained a warm, reassuring tone. Today, however, her expression looked more serious. "Rachel," the doctor said gently, "there's something we should talk about." Rachel felt her stomach tighten slightly. "Is the baby okay?" "The baby appears healthy," Dr. Grant replied carefully. "But some recent lab results raised a question that I believe you should be aware of." Rachel sat up a little straighter. The doctor turned the computer screen slightly so Rachel could see part of the medical report. "As part of your routine testing," Dr. Grant explained, "we conducted genetic screening. Normally, this simply confirms compatibility markers between the mother and the listed father." Rachel nodded slowly. The doctor paused before continuing. "However, the results suggest there may be a discrepancy." Rachel frowned. "What kind of discrepancy?" Dr. Grant spoke calmly, but her words carried a weight that Rachel hadn't expected. "There's a strong possibility that Ethan may not be the biological father." For several seconds Rachel didn't speak. The quiet hum of medical equipment filled the room. Her mind immediately drifted back several months. During the short period between the divorce paperwork and the night she and Ethan briefly reunited, Rachel had gone on a few casual dates. One of them had been with a man she met through a mutual friend. The relationship had never become serious. And after the unexpected night with Ethan, she had assumed the timeline made things clear. Now, that certainty suddenly felt less solid. "You're saying the dates might not match the way we thought," Rachel said slowly. Dr. Grant nodded. "Prenatal genetic testing can reveal possibilities earlier than people expect. It won't be completely confirmed until after the baby is born, but the indicators are quite strong." Rachel leaned back slightly, absorbing the information. The news brought two very different emotions at once. Part of her felt stunned. But another part felt strangely lighter. Because if Ethan wasn't the father, the entire conflict surrounding the pregnancy suddenly looked very different. What Rachel didn't know was that Ethan Caldwell had already discovered this possibility weeks earlier. Without telling anyone, Ethan had quietly arranged his own genetic screening through a private clinic. The results had arrived while he was still struggling to understand Vanessa's growing hostility toward Rachel. When Ethan saw the probability report suggesting he might not be the father, his first reaction had been disbelief. But instead of revealing the information immediately, he chose to stay silent. Part of him feared the truth would trigger an emotional explosion if revealed too quickly. Another part worried about how Vanessa might react if she discovered that weeks of suspicion and anger had been built on a possibility that might not even involve him. Back in the doctor's office, Rachel sat quietly processing the conversation. "So what happens now?" she finally asked. Dr. Grant smiled gently. "The pregnancy continues exactly the same way. Nothing about the baby's health changes. But it may be wise to discuss this with Ethan so everyone understands the situation clearly. Rachel nodded slowly. The conversation she had been avoiding suddenly felt unavoidable. After leaving the clinic, Rachel stepped into the parking lot and pulled out her phone. For a moment she simply stared at Ethan's name in her contact list. Despite everything that had happened between them, the truth deserved to be shared directly. She pressed the call button. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. But Ethan didn't answer. Across the city, Ethan stood near the window of his condo holding his own phone in his hand. Rachel's call lit up the screen. But his attention was fixed on something happening outside. Below, in the building's parking garage exit, Vanessa Cole's car pulled out onto the street. And the direction she had chosen to drive was unmistakable. She was heading straight toward Rachel's house. By the time Rachel Caldwell arrived home from the medical clinic, the sky had turned a dull shade of gray. The quiet neighborhood looked exactly the same as it always did: calm streets, tidy lawns, and houses that seemed untouched by conflict. But inside Rachel's mind, everything felt different. The doctor's words echoed again and again. There's a strong possibility Ethan is not the biological father. The revelation had shifted something deep inside her. For weeks, the pregnancy had been the center of tension, suspicion, and fear. Now that single piece of information threatened to change everything. Rachel stepped inside the house and set her purse down on the kitchen counter. Her phone was still in her hand. She considered calling Ethan again. The conversation couldn't wait much longer. If the baby wasn't his, the truth could end this entire conflict before it became something worse. Rachel had just unlocked her phone when a sharp sound broke the silence. A car door slammed outside. Rachel turned slowly toward the front window. A dark sedan had pulled into her driveway. Her heart skipped a beat the moment she recognized who stepped out of the vehicle. Vanessa Cole. Vanessa walked quickly toward the house with determined steps. There was no hesitation in her movement. Her posture was rigid, her expression tight with anger. Rachel barely had time to process what was happening before the doorbell rang. The sound echoed loudly through the quiet house. Rachel hesitated for a moment, then walked to the door and opened it. Vanessa stood inches away, her eyes burning with frustration. "We need to talk," Vanessa said immediately. Rachel stepped aside, allowing her inside. Vanessa walked straight into the living room without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes scanned the house as if the entire place represented something she deeply resented. "So this is where you've been planning it," Vanessa said coldly. Rachel frowned. "Planning what?" Vanessa turned sharply toward her. "Don't pretend you don't know what I'm talking about." Rachel closed the door slowly behind them. "I think you should explain what you mean," she said calmly. Vanessa crossed her arms, her voice rising with frustration. "You really thought a baby would bring him back, didn't you? That if you created enough responsibility, Ethan would never be able to leave you behind." Rachel stared at her quietly, absorbing the accusation. "You drove all the way here for that?" she asked. Vanessa's eyes flashed. "You've been manipulating him from the moment you found out you were pregnant." Rachel shook her head slowly. "That's not true." "Oh please," Vanessa snapped. "You expect me to believe this pregnancy just happened at the perfect moment?" Rachel walked toward the kitchen counter, resting her hands against the surface while taking a slow breath. "You're angry about something that might not even be real," she said. Vanessa's expression hardened. "What is that supposed to mean?" Rachel looked directly at her. "I had a doctor's appointment today." Vanessa waited, clearly expecting Rachel to defend herself. Instead, Rachel spoke calmly. "There's a strong possibility the baby isn't Ethan's." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Vanessa blinked as if she had misheard. "What did you just say?" Rachel met her gaze without hesitation. The baby might not be Ethan's. Silence filled the space between them. Vanessa stared at Rachel, her mind struggling to process the words. For months she had built a complete narrative in her mind. She had convinced herself that Rachel's pregnancy was a calculated move, a way to trap Ethan emotionally and keep him tied to the past. Now that belief suddenly had no ground to stand on. "You're lying," Vanessa said slowly. Rachel shook her head. "The doctor explained the genetic results this morning. There's a strong chance Ethan isn't the father." Vanessa's posture stiffened. All the late nights, the anger, the suspicion, every thought she had built around the pregnancy suddenly felt pointless. "You expect me to believe that?" Vanessa asked, though her voice had already lost some of its certainty. Before Rachel could respond, the front door suddenly opened. Ethan Caldwell stepped inside. He stopped the moment he saw both women standing in the living room. His expression immediately revealed the truth. He had arrived too late. Vanessa turned toward him slowly. "You knew," she said. Ethan didn't answer right away. The silence was enough. Vanessa's eyes widened. "You knew this whole time," she continued. Ethan exhaled slowly. "I wasn't completely sure." "But you suspected it," Vanessa said sharply. Ethan nodded slightly. Rachel looked at him in disbelief. "You already knew?" "I discovered the possibility weeks ago," Ethan admitted. "I didn't want things to explode before we had clear answers." Vanessa let out a short, bitter laugh. "So while I was trying to understand what she was doing," she said, "you were hiding the truth from me." Ethan stepped forward carefully. "Vanessa, I was trying to keep everyone calm." "Calm?" she repeated. Her composure finally cracked. "I spent weeks believing she was trying to destroy our relationship," Vanessa shouted. "Weeks thinking this baby would tie you back to her forever." Rachel said nothing. She simply watched the emotional collapse unfolding in front of her. Vanessa's eyes moved between them both. Anger mixed with humiliation. "If I ruined my life over a lie," she said, her voice shaking, "then someone is going to pay for it." The silence in Rachel Caldwell's living room lasted only a few seconds after Vanessa's final outburst, but the tension that followed lingered much longer. Ethan stood near the doorway, his shoulders tight with concern, while Rachel remained near the kitchen counter trying to process everything that had just happened. Vanessa's anger no longer looked like simple jealousy. It looked unstable. And far more dangerous than either of them had fully realized. Without another word, Vanessa grabbed her bag and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the quiet rooms, leaving an uneasy stillness in its wake. For several seconds neither Rachel nor Ethan spoke. Finally Ethan ran a hand across his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Rachel looked at him. "For what part?" she asked calmly. "For hiding the truth, or for letting this go so far?" Ethan didn't have an answer. That night, after thinking about everything that had happened, Rachel made a decision she had been avoiding. She called the police. When the responding officer arrived, Rachel explained everything that had happened over the past few weeks. The threatening message. The strange phone calls. The dark car that kept appearing outside her house. And the confrontation with Vanessa earlier that afternoon. Rachel spoke calmly, but the situation sounded increasingly serious as the details unfolded. Within a few days, the case was passed to investigators who began reviewing the information more closely. At first the incidents seemed scattered. But as officers started examining the evidence, a clear pattern began to form. Rachel's phone records showed multiple calls from temporary numbers. The threatening message had been sent through an anonymous texting application, but investigators quickly noticed something unusual. The timing of the messages often matched moments when Rachel had posted updates about her pregnancy online. That meant someone had been monitoring her closely. Then another discovery pushed the investigation even further. Several weeks earlier, a private investigator had been hired to collect information about Rachel Caldwell. Hiring a private investigator wasn't illegal. Surveillance work was often used in legal disputes. But the details of this assignment raised concerns. The client had requested extensive information about Rachel's schedule, daily routines, and medical appointments. The client's name was Vanessa Cole. As investigators began examining Vanessa's digital records, the picture became clearer. Emails showed regular communication between Vanessa and the investigator. Phone logs confirmed she had contacted Rachel multiple times using disposable numbers. Her internet history showed hours spent reviewing Rachel's social media pages. Vanessa had been studying Rachel's life with obsessive attention. The quiet strategy she believed was hidden was now visible through a long trail of digital evidence. When Ethan was contacted for questioning, the realization of what Vanessa had been doing finally hit him with full force. Sitting across from an officer in a small interview room, Ethan replayed the past few weeks in his mind. Vanessa's late-night research. Her sudden curiosity about Rachel's schedule. The documents he had briefly seen on her laptop. All the pieces finally connected. And the picture they formed made him deeply uncomfortable. Vanessa, however, saw the situation very differently. When investigators questioned her, she initially dismissed the accusations as misunderstandings. Her tone remained confident. Almost defensive. "I wasn't harassing anyone," she insisted. "I was trying to understand what Rachel was doing." But the evidence surrounding her actions made that explanation increasingly difficult to believe. Days later, Ethan met Vanessa one final time in a quiet conference room arranged by their lawyers. The atmosphere felt heavy from the moment they sat down. Vanessa looked exhausted, yet the stubborn determination in her eyes remained. "I did it for us," she said. Ethan stared at her. "For us?" he repeated. Vanessa leaned forward slightly. "You were too distracted by the past to see what she was doing," she said. "Someone had to protect our future." Ethan shook his head slowly. "There was never a future if it meant destroying someone else," he replied. The words landed harder than any argument. In the weeks that followed, Vanessa's life began unraveling piece by piece. News of the investigation spread quietly through the marketing firm where she worked. At first it was only whispers among coworkers. Then clients started asking questions. Projects she had been leading were reassigned to other employees. Meetings she once controlled were suddenly held without her. The professional reputation she had built so carefully began slipping away. Friends who once admired her ambitions slowly distanced themselves. The confident social life she once enjoyed faded into uncomfortable silence. Meanwhile, Rachel focused on rebuilding a sense of normal life. For the first time in weeks, she felt safer knowing the situation was finally being taken seriously. But one discovery during the investigation would reveal something even more disturbing. When authorities examined Vanessa's laptop files, they uncovered a hidden research folder. Inside were dozens of documents Vanessa had been studying late at night. The title suggested something far more calculated than simple jealousy. Articles about pregnancy complications. Online forums discussing ways miscarriages could be triggered. Medical discussions written in vague technical language. The investigators looked at the files carefully. And the conclusion they reached made the case far more serious. Vanessa Cole had not just been watching Rachel. She had been planning something far worse. In the end, the truth that was meant to silence Rachel Caldwell became the very thing that destroyed the woman who had tried to erase her. The investigation into Vanessa Cole's actions unfolded slowly but carefully. At first, authorities focused on the most obvious evidence: the threatening message Rachel had received, the anonymous phone calls, and the surveillance carried out by the private investigator Vanessa had hired. But as digital analysts continued examining the files recovered from Vanessa's laptop, they uncovered something far more troubling. Hidden among ordinary work documents and email drafts was a folder filled with online research. The search history showed weeks of late-night reading about pregnancy complications. There were discussions on anonymous forums where people debated dangerous and unethical ways miscarriages might be triggered. Several articles explored obscure medical methods that could potentially avoid detection. Vanessa had not actually carried out any of those actions. But the pattern of research was enough to raise serious legal concerns about her intentions. When investigators explained these findings to Rachel, a cold chill ran through her. For weeks she had felt that someone wanted the pregnancy to disappear. The threatening message had suggested it clearly, yet part of her had still hoped the fear was only in her imagination. Now the evidence proved that the danger had been real. Authorities moved forward with formal charges. Vanessa Cole was accused of harassment, stalking, and criminal intimidation. The threatening messages, the hired surveillance, and the disturbing research pattern formed a clear picture of deliberate intimidation directed toward a pregnant woman. Vanessa's carefully controlled life collapsed almost overnight. The marketing firm where she worked placed her on immediate leave while the legal process began. Clients who once admired her sharp business instincts suddenly wanted nothing to do with the controversy surrounding her name. Professional contacts who once praised her ambition stopped returning her calls. For someone who had built her identity around success and control, the exposure of her actions felt devastating. Ethan Caldwell was not entirely free from consequences either. Although he had not participated in Vanessa's behavior, investigators noted that he had recognized warning signs and remained silent. His decision to hide the possibility that the baby might not be his had allowed Vanessa's suspicions to grow unchecked. In professional circles, Ethan's reputation suffered. Colleagues who once trusted his careful judgment now questioned why he had waited so long to reveal the truth. Rachel, however, chose a different path forward. After giving her final statement to investigators, she gradually stepped away from the entire situation. The emotional weight of the past few months had taken a quiet toll on her, and she realized that the only thing truly worth her energy now was the life she was about to bring into the world. Slowly, the threatening messages stopped. The unfamiliar cars disappeared from her street. The uneasy feeling that had followed her for weeks finally began to fade. Months passed. On a bright morning in early spring, Rachel was admitted to the hospital. The labor was long and exhausting, but eventually the moment arrived that she had been waiting for. A healthy baby boy was placed gently in her arms. Rachel stared at him quietly, overwhelmed by the simple reality of his existence. After everything that had happened, the accusations, the threats, the investigation, the tiny life in her arms felt like the only thing that truly mattered. Later that afternoon, Ethan arrived at the hospital. He stood awkwardly near the doorway of Rachel's room, unsure how welcome he truly was. Rachel looked up when he entered, but her expression remained calm and distant. "He's beautiful," Ethan said softly. Rachel nodded. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. "I'm sorry for everything," Ethan finally said. "I should have handled things differently." Rachel looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms before answering. "You should have told the truth earlier," she said gently. Silence gave fear too much room to grow. Ethan knew there was nothing he could say to argue with that. After a few quiet minutes he left the room, understanding that Rachel's future no longer depended on him the way it once had. That evening the hospital room became quiet again. Rachel sat near the window holding her newborn son while the last light of the day faded behind the city buildings. She looked down at him and whispered softly, "No one will ever silence us again." Miles away, inside a quiet detention facility cell, Vanessa Cole sat alone. Her carefully constructed world had collapsed in a matter of weeks. Again and again, the same sentence echoed through her thoughts. "The baby isn't even Ethan's." Before we close this story, take a moment to think about what Rachel went through. Sometimes the truth arrives too late, and sometimes silence allows the wrong person to control the story. If you were in Rachel's place, pregnant, threatened, and surrounded by lies, would you have stayed silent to avoid chaos? Or would you have exposed the truth, even if it destroyed someone's life? Your answer might say more about courage than you realize.